All right, so thanks everyone for joining this webinar. My name is Judith. I'm Associate Director of Southern Plains Land Trust. Um, at Southern Plains Land Trust, um, when I first moved to the prairie to work on the preserves of Southern Plains Land Trust, I was like, it is so dry out there. Like, what amphibian chooses to live out there? And to my surprise, quite a lot of amphibians actually live there. Reptiles, I wasn't too surprised about because it's beautiful for snakes and turtles. But I was just very surprised about the sheer biodiversity of all the herpetology species that live out there. So, I think it was 2024 when we realized at Southern Plains Land Trust that we needed some more information, some solid information, what was actually living out there, what their distribution was, what their abundance was, if there were certain species of concern that we wanted to focus our conservation efforts on. And that's when we contacted ARC, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. And that ARC is a national nonprofit, so they work all throughout the United States, providing expertise on amphibian and reptile conservation. And tonight we've got Jess presenting for this webinar. Jess is one of the project coordinators of ARC, and she will be sharing the results of the large-scale survey that we had done by ARC and a little bit more about reptiles and amphibian conservation in general, I think.
Mhm.
Um, I invite everyone to turn their camera on if you feel comfortable or not, whatever you feel, but please keep yourself muted so that Jess isn't interrupted during her presentation. But feel free to ask questions in the chat box or after Jess is finished with her story, so that we can have a live Q&A when someone has a question. So I guess there you go, Jess, if you feel comfortable sharing your screen.
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay, you should be able to see the whole thing, correct?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Judith. I'm excited to be here this evening to talk to you all about amphibians and reptiles and the work that we did on the Southern Plains Land Trust. And as Judy said, my name is Jessica Meck. I'm a project coordinator with the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. And if you're wondering what parka is, you're going to learn about that in a few minutes. But wanted to give you a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So, we are a national nonprofit that was founded in 2007, and we are focused on identifying and conserving the highest priority places for amphibians and reptiles in the United States. And we were partly founded because of this massive regional group called PARC, so Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation. And this is a group of people that are dedicated to helping amphibians and reptiles. So, a lot of people are in the conservation field that are, work for the federal and state wildlife agencies, other nonprofits, land trust, wildlife rehabbers, private consultants, and so forth. And so, basically, if you care about amphibians and reptiles, you can be a part of this working group. And it's kind of broken up into different regions. You can see on the map on the left. And each region has their own annual meeting where everybody gets together and kind of talks about their accomplishments or things that they're struggling with in terms of the herpafauna community. And so we were founded in part to support this national working group as a nonprofit to do all the boring stuff nobody wants to do, like deal with the admin and the finances, but then also really focus on that on the ground conservation work with all the partners throughout this network, which makes us national. And so you might be asking, okay, why amphibians and reptiles? Why do we care about them? And whenever somebody asks me that question, I always say, why not? They are very unique. We're all sharing the same floating rock in space, full of life and diversity. And so, they deserve attention just like anything else. Um, but they're not as fuzzy and cuddly as your mammals. Maybe a lot of people find them slimy or scary or something, but they're really incredible in their own way. They are actually the most imperiled vertebrate group in the world, so a lot of their populations are declining, unfortunately, due to habitat loss and fragmentation, disease, and so forth. Um, and so somebody has to care about them, right? And so ARC is dedicated to amphibians and reptiles specifically. As you can see, they come in all shapes, colors, sizes, you name it. And they're very sensitive to their environment. They're indicators that the environment's healthy, the water quality is good. And especially salamanders, they're very sensitive. And something that's very unique to the US, the or the Appalachian Mountains in general, is considered a salamander capital of the world. We have the highest biodiversity and the number of species anywhere else on the planet. And they're pretty incredible. I mean, how can you not love these beautiful little creatures with their little bug eyes? And snakes and lizards, usually tend not to be people's favorite, but they also play a very important role. Snakes especially help control rodent populations, which help deter disease, especially tick-borne diseases. So your Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or whatever that is, they they help take care of the rodents, and they are also very cute in their own way. And then your turtles, they're also very diverse and beautiful. I spent most of my career helping these guys, and the gopher tortoise down in the lower right-hand corner, they're a keystone species. They help 350 other species by building their burrows and giving other critters homes. So they're very unique. They have their place in the ecosystem, and they're all interconnected. As we are with them. So, the more we protect them, the more that we're helping biodiversity, which helps keep a healthy environment. They need clean air and fresh water just as much as we do. So it's our job to be stewards in their conservation and protect them. And so because they're just equally unique and diverse, it's the landscapes and habitats they inhabit as well. So, mountain ranges and the Appalachians to the deserts and out west, with a wide variety of ponds and streams and everything that um, they, it's important that we protect that. And so one way that we do that is through PARCAs, Priority Amphibian Reptile Conservation Areas. That's the strategy we use. So these may look like just random polygons on a map that were drawn. And in part, that's true. But they're considered the most important areas for amphibians and reptiles identified by the state's experts and conservation stakeholders. So we meet with experts in a given state for 2 days and we talk about, what areas on the landscape can we have the biggest impact for reptiles and amphibians, whether it's habitat restoration, land protection, population recovery, and so forth. And so we identify these areas to focus our efforts and capacity on. And so this helps us down the road for species recovery. We identify these areas, then we work on partnership building in that park network, identify the capacity gap. So where is, boots on the ground needed, where is funding needed, and so forth. And that leads to kind of these four big categories that we focus our work on to achieve species recovery. The first being research and discovery. So we're asking questions, how are these species using their environment? How are they moving? What's the population size? Are they doing well? Are they not doing well? What can we do? Another thing is habitat restoration. So we know they're there, but maybe there's erosion happening, there's invasive plant species coming in. Maybe like pine forests, they're succeeding, and so there's too much understory and we have to remove it to give them the most suitable habitat possible. Another way we do this is through population recovery. So sometimes we establish captive breeding programs to release back in to the wild once we restore that habitat and make sure it's suitable for them. Sometimes we're head starting, which means that we are, taking eggs. So say, for example, we one of our focal species is bog turtles. So we protect their nests every year from predators, and then we make sure they hatch, and then we measure them, and then we let them go to prevent their nest from being predated. And then another big component is public engagement. So educating the public, like yourself, about all the work we do and how important these species are, and so forth. And so far, like I said, we are national. We've completed 29 states where we've identified these high priority areas. And 25 parkas, we have boots on the ground where our partners or we have field staff conducting on the ground conservation for folk species. And so you're probably wondering, we have, four regional programs, the Southern Apps, the East Coastal Plains, West Coastal Plains, and Southwest. But then you'll see in Colorado, this is our Southern Plains Land Trust work that we did. And so as you may already know, southeastern Colorado is beautiful. It's also a very biologically diverse region. It's the intersection of where the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains are, so this allows for a very diverse landscape in terms of the animals that can live there. Like I said, the more diversity there is, both in habitat and species as well. And so it is home to some of the state's most rare and threatened species across taxa, and that includes the speckled king snake, which is the snake in the upper right-hand corner, as well as the adorable black-footed ferrets. A lot of conservation going on in Colorado for them. And there is over 35 species of amphibians and reptiles. And one way that we think about too for conservation is we consider species of greatest conservation need, or SGCN. And what those are, which I promise is important later in the story when we get to what we found at Split. Um, but essentially, every single state creates what is called a state wildlife action plan, where they go and they rank all of the species in their state and they determine if the species is doing well or not. Is it, secure? Is it healthy? Is it, doesn't need a whole lot of intervention? Or is it critically impaired? Or this tier one, the highest concerned immediate need, where it basically allows states to prioritize where funding capacity needs to go for their different species. And this is for all taxa. So mammals, birds, invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, they all get ranked within a state. And all 50 states do this. Colorado is pretty cool. If you go to if you just Google Colorado State Wildlife Action Plan, they have a really cool dashboard interactive thing that you can go and explore some of the species you might be interested in. But the point is that these S1, S2, and S3 species, if they are ranked one of those, they're very important. And those are the ones that we tend to focus on because they need the most help, where we can have the most impact on their conservation. And it tends to be, in most cases, if you help one of these species, you're going to help a lot of other species as well. So getting to Southern Plains Land Trust, finally what you came here to learn about. So Heartland's Ranch in Raven's Nest is owned by Southern Plains Land Trust. And Heartland Ranch is about 43,000 acres, and nearby is Raven's Nest, and it's about 5,000 acres. So it's quite a bit smaller, but also very diverse and unique in its own way. And so one thing that Split has been doing incredibly well, and their goal for both of them is restoring grasslands and native or landscapes for native wildlife as a sanctuary. And they've been doing incredible work with it, black-footed ferret work as well, burrowing owls, but also for beaver and bison. And these are two species that are actually ecosystem engineers, is what we call them. They benefit a wide variety of species. The beaver, they change the landscape completely by changing hydrologies and building their dams. That benefits obviously a lot of amphibians. More water on the landscape, the more species you're going to have. Bison are the same way. They're an icon of the American West for a reason, because they naturally manage the prairies and the grasslands. And so these are two focal species that, SPLT has been focused on. And as Judith mentioned earlier, what about the amphibians and reptiles? What do you have, on these preserves that we can be taking into consideration on top of the other species that we're focused on? Because they're a huge part. And how we do this is we call it an inventory. So one of the main methods we use is called a visual encounter survey. So it's essentially where you're going out into the habitat, the wetlands, the streams, the prairie, and you're just walking around and you're coming across any species that you can. You can also do this via road. You can do road cruising, because a lot of reptiles are actually nocturnal and they kind of go to the roads at night to soak up the last remaining heat, because roads, especially if they're paved, hold the heat from the sun during the day. And so they're kind of attracted to roads at night. So it's a good way to find out, what's out there. Another way to do it is called an ARU, so an autonomous recording unit, where it's kind of like a game camera. You set it up on a tree next to a wetland, and you're recording any sounds. And specifically, we're looking for frog calls, frog and toad calls. Another really powerful tool that is really useful is environmental DNA, or eDNA. So just like humans, animals are constantly shedding their DNA. So like how we have DNA in our hair and our skin cells, they're constantly shedding it into their environment. And water is a great source because it's easy to collect and filter. Compared to, you can extract it from soil and so forth, but water preserves it a lot better. And so you can take a sample from the water, you can take it back to the field and filter it, and then you extract the DNA. And every single species has their very own special code, if you will. And we call it metabarcoding. And so you can see all the DNA that's in that sample and identify it down to the species, which is really cool and really powerful, which you'll see why here in a few minutes. And so we hired Graham Zephirin. So he's a Colorado resident, and we hired him through the Colorado Park Network. And he spent a lot of time between April to October of last year finding as many different species as he could across these two preserves. He logged over 260 hours of VES. So that means he was walking everywhere and also doing some road cruising in the evenings. 259 recording days, 29 eDNA samples, and then he also did 34 wetland assessments to kind of status to look at, are there invasive plant species? Is there beaver activity? And so forth. And so what were the results? The most exciting thing that you guys were waiting for. So within just that short amount of time, we were able to get over 1,000 wildlife detections of 62 unique species across taxa. So amphibians, birds, fish, mammal, and reptiles. And so that's what that bar graph is on the top left, is a breakdown of those 62 species. And so 26 of them were reptiles, which is really exciting. That is all pretty much thanks to his visual encounter work. And then 10 amphibians. And then the bird, fish, and mammal came from the eDNA alone, which is pretty cool. And 21 of those are species of greatest conservation need. So they are listed in the Colorado State Wildlife Action Plan as imperiled. And we typically look at those, again, S1, S2, and S3s. And 3 of those were amphibians and 8 of those were reptiles. And so these are a couple of species that Graham found, and these are his photographs. He's also an amazing photographer, so you'll see a lot of his pictures as well. And one thing that allows us to do, and you're thinking, okay, is that a lot? What does that mean? One thing that we can do with the data is we call these species accumulation curves, but it kind of allows us to see, how many species did we see out of what could be there? And so obviously with mammal, bird, and fish, we didn't get all that was there because that wasn't our focal species. But especially with, you can see with a reptile, between eDNA and especially VES, we detected almost every reptile species that could be in the region, and we came close with amphibians as well. So probably only a handful of species that we didn't detect that could be there, out of just, about 6 months worth of work. And then, if we were to go back and do more targeted sampling for the other species, you could see how close you were getting to that. But the point of this here is we found vast majority of the amphibians and reptiles that could be there. Now this might be hard to see, but the red outline is the Heartland Preserve um, boundary, and all those dots you see are where we detected amphibians on the left and reptiles on the right of conservation need, I believe, detection. Reptiles of concern, yes. So all of these species, listed in the State Wildlife Action Plan as needing help. S1 to S4s, I think, is what we included here. So you can see just like with our inventory methods, you can cover a lot of ground between VES and eDNA, and we got all these detections across the landscape. And that tells us a lot of information. And this is Raven's Nest here left. So again, able to cover quite a bit of ground. And two species that came up, especially a Chuang green toad, that's listed as the state as an S2, and Couch's spadefoot is a S1. And these are both really, really cool species that rely on ephemeral wetlands, especially. They have a very, very short life cycle, whereas Couch's spadefoot, they can lay their eggs in these ephemeral wetlands, and within 7 to 14 days, they are mini adults. They're little toadlets. And Chihuahuan green toads are the same way. They lay their eggs, and within 2 to 4 weeks, they're little toadlets. And so, they're very important, or kind of they're good to see on the landscape because you know that you have healthy functioning um, wetlands, and especially ephemeral wetlands. Other important SGCN that we detected was the speckled king snake, which this was actually just outside Heartland's boundary. It was a incidental observation that Graham had, but it very well is likely on Heartland Ranch. And so these two snake species, they're important because they prefer open woodlands and grasslands. And they have a very limited range in Colorado, which is why they're considered critically imperiled. The southeastern Colorado is just on the edge of their range. But if they're there, that's telling you that it's a functioning prairie ecosystem. And then two other species that we found were Texas horned lizard and plains leopard frog. The Texas horned lizard, other than being absolutely adorable, in my opinion, they're very, very small. They're only a couple inches long. Um, they also require native grasslands, and their primary prey is actually little native harvester ants. And then the plains leopard frog, again, they rely heavily on healthy, non-polluted wetland ecosystems, and they also require healthy upland for foraging during the non-breeding season. And one of their things, they're very sensitive to invasive species, such as, bullfrogs are actually invasive in Colorado, as well as exotic game species. And then, a healthy wetland ecosystem also doesn't have invasive species like tamarix, which is present. Invasive species are they're impossible to get rid of, but there is management that can be done, and SPLT's doing that. And so now that we know all these species are there, we can then decide, we can take that knowledge and put it into action, including habitat restoration, native tree planting. You can decide kind of what species you want to prioritize. So, we already have a handful of species that are critically imperiled in the state. And so then you can decide conservation actions from that. Um, and so that's where we're at with the road to species recovery. So we know what's at the Southern Plains Land Trust, and we can start identifying the capacity gap. So we can start understanding population needs, where are they distributed fully on the landscape, because Graham only had one season, but there were still plenty of other holes where he just couldn't get to in 6 months. So there's more work to be done in terms of finding out where these species um, are going, what they need, and then what we can do to write into what Split is already doing for all these other species, just to consider amphibians and reptiles and so forth. And so that's all I have. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I'd certainly like to thank Judith and Henry at the Southern Plains Land Trust for inviting us and letting us do this incredible work. And if you're interested in ARC and learning more about what we do, you can follow us on all social medias, and that QR code will take you described to our newsletter. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thanks, Jess. That's
Mhm.
amazing. And your website is arcprotects.org, and it's an amazing website as well. A lot of beautiful photographs. No, that was so helpful and amazing to see kind of what Graham found and what you guys have been shaping around his observations. And the good news is that Jess is coming to Heartland next week.
Yes, I'm
To
very excited.
be, yeah, it's going to be extremely exciting because the next step in this is to create an amphibian pond for especially focus on those two toads, the S1 and the S2, Couch's spadefoot and the Chihuahuan green toad. So Jess is coming down to Heartland. We're going to see in the field what we're going to do next, like in reality. Um,
Yes.
Let me start with just one general question, and I see one question in the chat, and everyone's welcome to either raise your hand. Like there's a little option where you can raise your hand, and then I can click on your thing to unmute, or I'll just read the questions from the chat. But my very general ecological question was, what do all these reptiles and amphibians do in the winter? Like, where do they go? What do they do?
Great question. Yeah, so most of them, if not all of them actually, especially in the southeast, they burrow underground. So, or a lot of them, so trying to think of a good example. I mean, the vast majority of them, so the salamanders, and the snakes and the lizards, they pretty much all go underground, for the winter below the frost line. And, the turtles and some frogs, they will actually freeze. So if it's, a permanent wetland source, and especially if it's deeper, so that's why those beaver ponds are also very important, is that turtles, they can basically sit underneath the ice, and as well as frogs, they can slow their metabolism down, or their heartbeats are only beating like once every minute or few minutes. They're pretty incredible that way. And then when the temperatures rise, they come back out.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Um, well, I see one question in the chat already from Zach. Zach, do you want to ask the question yourself? Should I just? The question was, um,
Whatever you want, Judith. But sure,
go
I'll ask
ahead,
it since you
take it
called
away.
me out. I was curious. You mentioned the bullfrogs being invasive and how that can affect the native plains leopard frog. So the question is there any sort of management plan for American bullfrogs at Split? How are bullfrogs being dealt with on the preserve?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as of right now, I don't think we have a plan. So we actually saw through the eDNA that bullfrogs were quite widespread, especially on Raven's Nest, um, and so forth. And so they obviously they're right on the edge of their native range in Colorado, but we talked to Colorado DNR, and they do classify them as invasive. because they do outcompete the native species, and they're kind of like the trash bins of the wetland. They eat everything. So all the eggs, the tadpoles, toadlets or anything like bullfrogs will eat it. Um, and, unlike the East Coast where they've evolved with so many other species and so forth, because of the lack of water on the landscape, bullfrogs they're kind of a problem. And so we're kind of getting a feel, we kind of understand where they are now on the preserves. And so that's kind of the next step is how do we want to manage bullfrogs? And so there's a lot of different ways to humanely euthanize them. In Arizona, we actually use them for educational purposes for science classes to dissect frogs and, teach the next generation about ecology and biology and so forth. So right now there's not a plan, but there will be
And
here in the near
Jess,
future.
to add to that, I think you also told me that it is possible to make a water body more unfavorable for a bullfrog and more favorable for the native species. For example, by not having a permanent water present. Like,
Hmm.
so the fact that the bullfrog, um, that life cycle is different from the native amphibians could be a management plan in itself, right? Where it's just too unfavorable for those little bullfrog egg masses to survive.
Yes, 100%. So they require permanent water, and their life cycle is so much slower. They can stay in tadpole stage months or even a year sometimes. And so if you have more ephemeral wetlands, they won't establish themselves there because they can't. And it's also about the vegetation that's in the wetland as well. So moving cattails and other things that they find favorable to forage and hide in and lay their eggs. It's a little quite different than, say the couch's spadefoot and the green toad.
Yeah, cool. Let's see. If anyone else has a question, I'll keep checking if people are raising their hand or putting things in the chat. Um, I was wondering if one or multiple of the species that Graham found were a surprise. Were they outside of the range that they had been recorded for previously?
No, I don't think, well, did we get a record? I believe the speckled king snake was definitely a surprise. I mean, because it was like just outside Heartland. That one, I mean, it's one of the rarest snakes in the state. So that was really cool to see. Um, I'm trying to think. I'm looking at the list.
Because it was kind of a surprise to find so many species, right? Because it's um yeah, definitely considered a hotspot now by
Hmm.
the sheer number that he found.
Yeah, which is a true testament to Graham for sure. He spent a lot of time out there, which we are extremely grateful for. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm kind of blanking on it, to be honest. The most of them were not surprising because they were very well within the range. And, Southeast Colorado is very much a diverse hotspot. Um, but I think finding some of those S1s, like I think the long-nosed snake, that was surprising and a really cool find. The speckled king snake. I'm blanking on the one that I feel like he got a county record of, like the first county record for the species, and I can't remember which that one was.
I'll put it on the YouTube recording afterward.
Yes, we'll have to figure it out.
I was wondering if and this is just like nationwide, but are there any reptiles or amphibians that have suddenly drastically declined in the past year or years? That it's like a disaster, like almost extinct kind of story?
Um, what a great question.
I'm throwing you under the bus, Jess. I'm sorry.
I know, making
Because
me think.
it's just not a group that I have a lot of experience with. And I'm just like, is there a reptile that's just like almost extinct that we yeah that people should be aware of?
The only thing I can think of is a salamander actually. So the hickory nut gorge green salamander. It's found only in a very specific gorge in North Carolina, and it was already, critically endangered. And then Hurricane Helene came in. 2024. It's been 2 years now. Wow. And created a lot of massive, devastating flooding and landslides that honestly knocked out the vast majority of its habitat. So our executive director, actually, JJ Afdaka, he spent a long time working with this species, and he actually helped identify in 2019 formally as its own species of the green salamander. So taxonomically, did that genetic work and, doing annual population surveys, and it's already very endemic, a very small area, and then this hurricane came in. And so quickly jumped in with local partners, and we actually started a captive breeding program with the North Carolina Zoo to help avoid them going extinct in the wild. So basically an assurance colony, because they require, mature trees and canopy cover and with the landslide. So working on that, and there's also another salamander, the Jemez mountain salamander in New Mexico. The one of our staff members, Nancy Character, she's a director of uh, conservation science, and she spent years and decades working with this salamander. And it's kind of the same story. It's found very small region in New Mexico at higher elevations, and with climate change and more frequency of wildfires, they're honestly close to extinction. So we started a captive breeding program there, and working. So those are the two at the top of my head because I've been kind of uh involved with, but I can't think of a reptile
Well,
species or
we
something.
that made me realize that we are in the early stages of reintroducing the desert Mississauga, which is a rattlesnake, which is a very rare, um, yeah, rattlesnake. Do you know anything about that species?
I honestly don't know. I've been starting to learn about it because we've been talking about, connecting with Colorado and the Denver
Yeah,
Zoo about it. So that's not a species. I'm more of a expert on the East Coast with my species, but very fun learning about all the Colorado and the Western species for sure.
yeah, it would be so cool to reintroduce another endangered species to Heartland. And
Definitely.
we're working with Denver Zoo on that one. Um, any other questions? What's your favorite reptile, people? Just throw it in there. Um, there was one salamander species found on Heartland, right? Was it?
Yeah, the Western tiger salamander. So
Yeah.
that was, yeah, I had a picture of that. Or let's see. Yeah,
Oh,
they
there
were
you
really
go.
cool.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
beautiful. All right. Well, I think if no one has any other questions, I would like to thank you, Jess. It was extremely informative. Like I said, this was the start. This is the foundation of what we will be doing in terms of reptile and amphibian conservation in the future. We now kind of know what our species of concern are, where they are, and what we can do to help them. And like Jess said, once you help one species, you will help more species. Um, yeah, a lot of exciting things coming up in terms of reintroducing an endangered reptile, creating an amphibian pond for those couches, spadefoot, and Chihuahua and green toad. So I'll keep everyone updated. Thanks, Jess. I think people can go to your website and subscribe to your newsletter and maybe even donate towards ARC because you're also a nonprofit. Yeah, and we'll be in touch. I'll see you next week.
Yes, looking forward to it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Take care.
Here we go.